All right. Hi, everybody. I just want to apologize to this little group right here. I will not be able to see you because this is in my way, but I'm thinking of you, and I'm glad you're here. All right? With the rest of you, I'll be able to see. Okay, so my name is Ryan Calo, and I'm honored to be able to moderate this session now on animals, robots, and persons. I am a law professor at the University of Washington, just up the street, so to speak, and I'm going to introduce my my panelists today, and then we're going to jump right into a Q&A. So this is a little bit of a change from your usual format. We're just going to be talking, and we built in a lot of time also for your questions and your thoughts. One of the things I want to stress to you is that we're new to animal law, right? So we may say things that you just bristle at. They seem basic to you. They seem ridiculous, right? So remember, we come from a different community, but we're also, all three of us, I think, very, very excited to be here. We all attended the sessions yesterday and learned a ton, and we care deeply about the issues, but we're new to it. Okay, so just to my left and your right, we have Paresh Kathrani. He is a very interesting polymath of a person. Right now he works in arbitration at an international level, but he has a law degree and a PhD in philosophy. I just learned actually Sartre, so continental philosophy, and also has worked on a wide variety of issues, including the legal status of refugees, and deeply in artificial intelligence and robotics ethics, including working quite a bit with the European Union and Commission on their reports. And so he is a very deep and broad scholar, and we're excited to have him here. So I'm really glad you're here. The other person on this panel has been known to me for quite a long time, and her name is Kate Darling. She is a researcher at the MIT Media Lab, where her research concentrates on social robotics and on the ethics of artificial intelligence and robots. She is, without question, just one of the leading scholars in the world on these sets of issues. But an interesting thing about Kate is that she's also really prominent within intellectual property law. And indeed won a prestigious award just 2 years ago for her work in intellectual property. So she was very excited when there was the monkey selfie case. I don't know if you guys were as excited as she was, but she was quite excited because of the intellectual property dimensions of that too. So we're really lucky to have both Paresh and Kate here. Okay, so I'm going to shut up in a second and just be asking questions. I just want to say briefly that, two things draw a robotics law and torts law scholar like myself to animal law. One is that we in technology law are struggling to figure out what our identity is. Why would you study technology apart from any other social fact? What's the organizing principle? And so I got in touch with this community trying to explore, gosh, how did you build animal law? How did you use animal law, which after all has a bit of everything in it, right? A bit of every kind of law. How did you unify that into just a wonderful, vibrant field in such an interesting conversation? So I came to that looking for that. But the other thing that I personally find very fascinating, and I hope comes up today, is that there is a commonality, not an equivalence, but a commonality, which is that the law struggles to characterize robots and artificial intelligence. It just has a real big problem. Maybe in a little bit later, if there's time, I'll tell some stories about the times that law has had a really tough time characterizing robots and artificial intelligence. So in terms of animals being something that the law has trouble categorizing and that people's intuitions differ, that's an area of overlap. But to set some background, I wanted to ask my panelists the following. So first of all, what is robot ethics? What is a robot ethics? What does a person in robot ethics do? I think I'm going to start with Kate on this one. So what is robot ethics, and what does a robot ethicist do?
Well, first, let me just start by saying I don't want to turn this into like a internal love fest up here, but Ryan didn't really introduce himself properly, and I think it's important to know that Ryan Calo is, one of the foremost, if not the leading scholar in robotics law in the world. Like, you started this conference called We Robot that's on the legal and policy issues in robotics with a few of your colleagues, but you've really been pushing this as a field, like back in the day when people thought that this was just crazy to even be looking at. And so that's Ryan.
Thanks, Kate.
But robot ethics sounds kind of science fiction-y, like Blade Runner or all of these science fiction movies we know, but what robot ethics actually concerns itself with as a field is how we're integrating robotic technology, artificial intelligent technology, and some of the social and ethical issues that are arising right now. And that can range from responsibility for harm, if we're looking at automated weapon systems or autonomous vehicles, or it can be about the social issues of using algorithms that draw from biased data sets and using them in the criminal justice system, which is already happening. Or it can be about the social issues of supplementing versus replacing human labor. So a whole range of issues around privacy and social issues and tort law that are arising as we integrate these new technologies. That's what robot ethics is about.
Yeah, and do you want to add to that and talk a little bit of, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ryan, for your introduction, and thank you very much to the Animal Legal Defense Fund for the opportunity for being here today and presenting at this conference. If I'm a bit slow in my speech, it's because I've flown in from London and my body is like 8 hours ahead of my mind right now, so please excuse me for that. But I guess Ryan mentioned that my PhD was in philosophy, and I'll talk a bit about that during the course of today's talk. But certainly when I look at ethics, I tend to not look at robot ethics as a joint phenomena. I look at the ethics and how robotics informs the ethics. And of course, the ethical side of what ethics are, there are different philosophies, different theories of ethics, virtue ethics, deontology, utilitarianism. And then we ask ourselves, well, what does robotics lend to that? So for me, robot ethics is the way in which we, either from a virtue perspective, from a utilitarian perspective, from an ontological perspective, engage with these machines. Some people look at robot ethics from the perspective of the robots themselves. What ethical duties might robots owe? So for example, there's a big debate going on right now about robot rights. Do robots have rights? Do they owe duties? And what are the ethics that robots might owe to us? But of course, there's a flip side of that, and that's what responsibilities, what ethical duties we owe to robots. And so for me, it's about understanding two phenomena, which are both separate and joint at the same time. What does ethics mean? What does ethics mean vis-a-vis a robot as opposed to a human? And how those two concepts come together and how they basically inform each other.
Right. So obviously we are here at an animal law conference, and the audience is interested in how all of this relates to animals. And so as a way into that conversation, I'm going to start now with you, Paresh, if I may. What interests you about animals? What draws you to thinking about animals? Yeah.
I mean, so whenever we're engaging with objects in the world, or entities in the world, or others in the world, I mean, my research focuses quite heavily on the philosophy of the other, the way in which we as people construct the other. And I think often there's a tendency to differentiate between us and the other. Like, I'm a person, you're different to me, you're a different species, you're a different race, you're a different gender, etc. For me, my research isn't based upon that. I look at the dignity of the generic notion of dignity, the way in which we engage with the world. Ultimately, from a first ethics point of view, we are all part of one substance, and then essentially differences arise upon that. So I can talk a bit about, I will talk a bit about my research into asylum seekers, which kind of informs the way in which I perceive our treatment of animals, if I may. So I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about my early research. I worked with asylum seekers for 6 years, refugees who were coming to the UK. And in doing so, some of you might know, for example, refugees are those who have been persecuted. They come to a country looking for protection. And I spent a lot of time looking at refugee law, refugee convention, UK statutes, etc. And whenever I used to accompany asylum seekers to asylum centres, I was always struck by the veracity or the strength of their story and how they were treated, the perception of them. And so when I thought, okay, well, the law says if someone presents as being persecuted and they have evidence to support it, then they should be given protection. But yet, the way in which they were treated was something slightly different to that. So I started digging into the way in which we interpret and apply the law, and ultimately, my PhD research was on the construction of the refugee as the other, and how we take a very deterministic approach to the law. So I guess when it comes to animals, apart from the fact that my sister's a vet and we are a family of animal lovers, I guess my interest in animals is about how the law constructs animals, how it constructs people, how it constructs the other. And so I guess that for me it's about how the law is used as a system or as an instrument to basically deconstruct other people and to, in many ways, exercise power over them.
Fascinating, yeah. So what about you, Kate? Why are you interested in animals?
Well, I've always been a huge proponent of animal rights and love animal law. I took a lot of animal philosophy classes in college, but my current interest in animals is that I've realized that in a lot of the conversations in robotics, there's something we do almost constantly, which is we are constantly comparing robots to people and artificial intelligence to human intelligence. Like if you do a stock photo image search for AI, you get a lot of human brains and humanoid robots. I had a kid 2 years ago, and for 2 years people have been saying, oh, Kate, you love robots. You must think it's so interesting to watch your kid's brain develop, and because it's just like an AI. And I'm like, no, actually it's not. My kid learns in a really different way, but we have this very human-centric idea of what intelligence is and intelligence should be and the intelligence we should be building. And it just strikes me that, AI is already much better than us at a lot of things. Like, AI can do math and beat us at chess and Jeopardy and Go and those things and recognize patterns in data. But then there are other areas where we are more skilled than AI. Like if you ask Siri to call you an ambulance, there's a good chance she'll say, okay, from now on, I'll call you an ambulance. And so I just feel like animals are a really good example of these entities that we have been, had a relationship with that have very different skill sets that are much better than us at some things, and some things we might be better than them. And I'm actually writing a book right now. I'm not here to plug it because it's not coming out anytime soon, but it's called The New Breed, and it looks at the history of our relationship with animals and why we've used animals for work and weaponry and companionship. And I feel like there are a lot of things that we can learn from that history, as problematic as it is, but there are a lot of parallels in terms of things like responsibility for harm, for example. People are throwing up their hands in the robotics world. Oh, how are we possibly going to assign responsibility for harm when an autonomous agent makes a decision that we couldn't foresee? Well, but if you go back to the first laws even known to humankind that were written on clay tablets, some of them are about what happens if my ox wanders into the street and gores somebody, who's responsible for that. So there are a lot of parallels there. And then I also think there are some interesting parallels if we look at the research in human-robot interaction, which is really where I'm focused, and people's emotional responses to robots. It's kind of starting to show how hypocritical we are in terms of how we relate to other entities, and kind of shine a light on how hypocritical we've been in our relationships with animals as well.
So I want to follow up about that point, actually. And I just want you to know we're going to build in a lot of time for Q&A, so we're very, very excited to hear from each of you. Follow up with that point about shedding light, right? So in what sense? I mean, why would human-robot interaction, as it sounds, is a sort of deeply methodical study of the way in which people interact with robots, and it informs the design of robots, but it also informs developmental and other areas of psychology. It's quite an interdisciplinary and extensive field. But why are insights from that? Why do they point to a hypocrisy, and how does that have anything to do with animals?
Okay, so my main interest in robots is that people will treat them like they're alive, even though they know perfectly well that they're just machines. And there are a bunch of reasons why people do this. There's science fiction and pop culture that kind of primes us to want to personify robots. There's the novelty of the technology coming into shared spaces. Maybe people are having some novel reactions that will fade over generations. But then there's this inherent biological trigger that we have to autonomous entities in our physical space. So it seems like our brains are constantly scanning our environments and trying to figure out what's an object and what's an agent, which makes sense evolutionarily because the agents were more dangerous. But so robots have this thing where they move like an agent does. They move like an animal or like a human, and it tricks our brains into projecting intent onto the robots. And then through a lot of design in robotics, if we're intentionally trying to create robots that have faces and eyes and that mimic cues that people automatically subconsciously associate with states of mind, then it really taps into this tendency and also our tendency to just anthropomorphize everything. We anthropomorphize animals, obviously, but we also anthropomorphize objects, and people anthropomorphize robots really strongly as well. And so, you see people do this even with really simple robots, like the Roomba vacuum cleaner. That's just a disc that roams around the floor. Over 80% of Roombas have names. People feel bad for them when they get stuck in the curtains.
I've heard about play dates, that some people bring their Roombas on play dates.
There's been studies on this where they do play dates. The companies, like people will send in their Roomba for repair, and they'll get the offer of a brand new replacement Roomba, and they'll be like, no, we want you to send Meryl Sweep back to us. And that's just a disc, right? And then so you get into these really interesting, as the design gets more and more lifelike. So in 2015, Boston Dynamics released this video. They make these very biologically inspired robots. Some of you may have seen this. So they released a video with a robot named Spot that looked kind of like a dog. It was very dog inspired. And in the video, the engineers kick Spot because they want to demonstrate that Spot doesn't fall over when you kick it. And I'm not sure if they expected the reactions online to be quite what they were, because everyone in robotics was like, oh, it's amazing, it doesn't fall over, and everyone else felt kind of uncomfortable with what was happening in the video. And I think PETA actually had to release a press statement at some point because journalists were calling them. And I actually really liked PETA's press statement because they were like, we're not going to lose any sleep over this because it's not a real dog. It doesn't have feelings. But they also said that most people might find the idea of this violence inappropriate. And I would take that even further and say that it's possible that not only do people find it inappropriate, but it might actually, as this design gets better, become desensitizing to people to behave violently towards very lifelike robotic objects. And what does that mean for animal law? I think, and I'll circle back to your question, but the whole violence thing is really interesting to me. We don't know, is it a healthy outlet for violent behavior if someone is kicking a robot dog instead of a real dog, or is it training our cruelty muscles, right? And if it's training our cruelty muscles, then suddenly we have an argument for maybe the Kantian philosophy protection of robots. But what does that mean? Does that mean we're throwing robots and animals in the same category? And I actually don't think it does. I think that, perhaps if we make robots a type of moral patient that relies on this Kantian philosophy argument, maybe that elevates animals to a status where, you know, we're not relying on this Kantian argument, where we're actually caring about, you know, the sentience of the animals. And the reason I think we need to elevate that is because what the research in human-robot interaction shows, to get to your point, is that we treat, you know, most robots like tools and products, and some we treat like companions and living things, and we've been doing the same thing to animals throughout history. And what that really shows us is that even if we know perfectly well that something isn't alive, we will empathize with it and relate to it. And does that mean that we actually don't care that animals are alive either? Are we actually just trying to protect the animals that we relate to the most, that we're projecting ourselves onto? And I think that that insight from robotics, like really kind of putting that mirror in front of people, might be an opportunity to get people to reflect on how they are treating animals and get us closer, and by us, I mean, you know, general society, closer to how we would like to see ourselves, which is actually caring about animal suffering instead of just caring about ourselves.
Yeah, and that goes, I see now, that goes to the hypocrisy. I mean, because some of the things that we've been hearing at this conference, and I've heard other times listening to people working in the area, is that people will say that they love animals, and they will, in fact, think that they love their dog or their cat or whatever it happens to be, but then somehow be unable to empathize with the plight of other kinds of animals in other contexts, you know, like farms and so on. And that's, so it's sort of fascinating how that dynamic, though, again, not to make an equivalence, plays out in a particular. So I want to bring Paresh in here. So first of all, I have a different question for you, but I do want to give you a chance to reflect on this as it relates closely to your research. What are your thoughts about the way that we are hardwired in a way to react to these technologies in a particular way?
I think there's an element of instrumentalism that goes on here. So I think we need to pitch this at the level of values. Machines, robots, they display intelligence. Intelligence is something that we value as human beings. Robots might have, for example, human faces. We value faces. We value the smile of an infant. We value the look of a person. We value the presence of other human beings. Robots might move. They might display human-like tendencies, and of course, movement is something that we value. So when we look at machines which display these properties, such as intelligence and humanistic characteristics, then I think instinctively there should be something within us that triggers the empathy that Kate mentioned, and should make us think, well, to value the entity. But then if you were to say, let's give that robot rights, people would be taken aback and say, no, I'm not giving robot rights is ridiculous. So why do we have this paradox between, on the one hand, having an entity that displays humanistic characteristics, but yet we recoil from the idea of giving a machine rights? It is a paradox. And it simply comes down to that when we as people, of course, when we tend to look at other objects, the value that we assign has an instrumental value. I'm not saying that happens in every case, but there is yesterday someone mentioned utilitarianism, for example, the idea that the way in which we ethically behave is based upon value considerations, is a benefit of X more than a benefit of Y. So we do tend to often adopt this instrumental approach. Does it benefit us to give machine rights? Does it benefit us to recognize animals as people as opposed to property? And I think that a lot, at the root of law, actually at the root of words, there is a lot of instrumentalism that goes on and a picking and choosing, and that colors how we perceive robots, essentially. And I think that there's an objectification that goes on there. In the same way, for example, you have an object like, let's say, a car. A car is defined by certain criteria and characteristics. In the same way, we do the same in machines. We say, well, look, a machine is an object because it meets X, Y, and Z. So there's a lot of instrumental objectification that goes on there at the expense of recognizing the dignity of machines.
So I remember.
Can I just
please,
follow
of
up
course.
on that? Because
Yeah.
I do want to, but do you think that the case for animal rights and robot rights is the same? Because I think there's a case for both, but for different reasons.
So I'm not I'll put a disclaimer forward here. I'm not an advocate of robot rights. Ultimately, I'm a philosopher. I like thinking about things which doesn't necessarily translate into advocacy. So I like looking at robot rights as an element of theory. And often when I'm having debates and conversations with people about robot rights, they tend to take a step back and say, well, no. And when you break the argument down, what it comes down to is that they don't think machines should have rights because they equate those rights to human rights. The idea that machines should be given rights, well, how can a machine have the right to life? How can it have the freedom of expression? But there is a category error that's going on there. When one says robots should have rights, it's not the same thing as saying they should have human rights. Ontologically, a robot is a separate entity from a human being. So when someone is saying that a robot should have rights, that's not the same thing as saying that they should have human rights. They should have rights that are distinct to robots. So I think that when we talk about animal rights, certainly I think there might be a more closer synergy and a crossover between the rights we afford to humans, such as dignity and certain other human rights. But yet, animals may have distinctive rights that they deserve by virtue of their very ontology, their very entity. So looking at all three of these things, robots, animals, and humans, there might be some crossover or correlation between rights, but I also think that they need to be ontologically approached as separate entities, as well as to be seen having their own dignity and their own being.
So, I want to put a finer point on this because it's something I've been thinking about a lot over the course of this great conference, which is, is there a problem with people advocating for, which I know you're not doing, advocating for rights for robots when, as we've just heard again and again, that apart from some lip service and certain context, like animals are not actually given legal status and legal rights. So I'm reminded of a situation where someone was talking about driverless cars in Saudi Arabia. And there's something, I think, a little bit sort of fearing of the other and essentializing about this comment that I'm about to make, and I'm not endorsing it, but as a quip, it was an interesting one, which was, isn't it interesting that robots are able to drive in Saudi Arabia before women, right? And so, the point of the person who made this statement was to try to talk about a hierarchy, And so let me put a fine point on this, right? Is there a danger in making a false equivalency here? And is there a danger in pursuing rights? Is there a danger in pursuing rights of an artificial intelligence to get a copyright or a patent, even for utilitarian reasons, but then not give one to an animal that has engaged in a similar? You see what I'm saying? I'm asking.
Yeah,
Maybe I can start with you, Kate.
Well, I'm guilty of this. People email me all the time because I wrote a paper in 2012 that was advocating or making the case for moral patiency for robots for this the Kantian reason of it's training our cruelty muscles if we behave violently towards lifelike objects. So maybe we should give them protections similar to animal abuse protections. However, I don't think that the two things are equivalent at all. In fact, I think that the Kantian argument should not apply to animals, and I'm glad to see that, in legal reasoning, we're moving away from that and more towards centering the animals and centering their suffering, because the big difference between animals and robots, and it's not changing anytime soon, is that animals can feel things, and robots don't have feelings. So I think that the two cases for moral patiency are very, very different, and I am hopeful that introducing robots as a new category of moral patient can actually elevate the animals, because it makes it very clear that the animals are closer to us, and we have an internal, intrinsic, we have feelings, and that is, should obviously, rank above, just the moral patiency argument for the robots. Now, of course, we have a bad history in creating these hierarchies, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Do you want to add to that? I have it, yeah.
I think Kate hijacked my argument, essentially. I agree with what she said. It's not a question of equivalency. We're not saying that as I go back to the point I made before, we're not saying that animals are equivalent to machines or equivalent to human beings. They're essentially entities in their own rights. They have arguments in their own rights. I don't think there's an element of hierarchy that goes on here. I think that each should be approached in its own way, and I think it creates a category error, and the problem arises because we conflate one with another. And I certainly see that going on in the case of animals, for example, the idea that somehow equating animals with humans, for example, some people believe might denigrate the idea of what the social contract is or what humans are. I think that's a category error. We need to look at them as distinct categories and look at them in their own rights. There is no equivalency, there's no conflation that goes on there.
Okay, so just to give you the audience a little roadmap, so I have one more topic I want to talk about, and then I want to open it up for questions. But again, we'll have plenty of time, because I'm sure that these interesting panelists are no doubt provoking ideas in you too. So I mentioned at the top that there are times when the law struggles. It makes category errors, it struggles to categorize. And this happens, I'm still thinking about you guys over there, I just want you to know that, yeah, especially you in the corner, but I just have you in mind. What the law struggles with categorization of things like robots precisely because they invoke in us these strange anthropomorphic reactions. And one of my favorite examples of this is, does anybody in this room, do you guys know what Chucky Cheese is? You know Chucky Cheese? Yeah, I have to be careful with my allusions sometimes because I'm a torts professor and most of my students are in their 20s, and so I will make references to things and they'll be like, Professor K, we have no idea what you're talking about, but Chucky Cheese. Okay, so Chucky Cheese, kids restaurant, really gross balls that you jump into and things like that. But source of many a flu. But what they have is they have these robots that
I don't think they have them anymore.
They don't anymore. They once did. That's right. They got rid of them for reasons I'm not totally clear on. And
That's the best part of Chucky Cheese.
Wondering if I can get my hands on one and put it in my lab. But they were there. They were these anthropomorphic robots, and what they would do is they would occasionally sort of come alive and do a song. Right, and they would play in a little band and so on. And the kids would all shut up and listen to them, and it was really, it was lovely. It was wonderful. So in Maryland, in the 1990s, this sort of enterprising tax authority went to a Chucky Cheese, and they saw these robots, and these robots played in this little band, and they said, "Whoa, wait a second. You have to pay a performance tax on the food that you served here because you obviously have a performance." And then Chuck E. Cheese was like, "You talking about the robots? Like this is just it's just a puppet. It's just a mouse that has a guitar. It's not like a performance." And Maryland was like, "No, it's a performance, and you have to pay performance tax." So this went up to the courts, and the courts had to decide whether robots could perform. And they talked about what was a performance and how it required spontaneity and all these other sort of things. And they found that in this particular instance, these anthropomorphic robots were nothing more than a complex jukebox. But I can tell you there are many, many, many cases, and I could rattle off a bunch of them, in which the law has sort of struggled to categorize robots, okay? So then my question. It's so interesting to students of robotics law, at least, that there are things that you can do when you do them with robots where there is a completely different reaction by the law than if you do the identical same thing with an animal, right? So for example, if you want to deliver drugs or vaccines or something to a rural area using drones, you need to go to the Federal Aviation Administration, you need to file a waiver, it's like a whole thing. I mean, it's a really detailed process. But if you want to do that with a pigeon, you could do it right now, right? Or alternatively, there have been bars that have prevented, or restaurants that have prevented people from bringing augmented reality into the area, even if it's an assistive technology that is being used by people living with differences. If you need your technology in order to get around, it can still be banned from a restaurant, and you could be prevented. But if you have an animal that is an assistive animal, federal law says you may not prevent such a person from entering the premise, right? So what do we think is going on there? Does either of you want to comment on why does the law struggle to categorize these things like animals and robots, and why do they treat the same exact thing differently when we're talking about one versus the other?
Because they're not, I mean, well, and like there might be some arguments for making a difference, and we can get into that, but I think that what's actually going on here is that people aren't thinking of this analogy. When they're thinking about robots, they're thinking of either something that's completely new, or they're comparing it to humans, like in the Chucky Cheese case, and it's so important, the analogies that we use, and you've written about this, and some of our colleagues have written about this, that like the analogies that are in the minds of policymakers are so incredibly important, and I don't think that animals have been properly, recognized as the appropriate analogy here, even though, to me, it's so obvious. Like, you have these entities that can sense and think and make autonomous decisions and learn and cause harm, and we've been dealing with this for so many years, and yet I don't think it's on people's minds when they talk about robotic tech.
I'm thinking, what's Chucky Cheese? I've never, so
you don't know Chucky Cheese? Okay, well,
only person who doesn't know what
get along with my students,
but no, I think it's a question of trust. I think that, of course, when it comes to animals, we have a long history, of course, going back to how many thousands of years. We have been with animals. We've had animals in our homes. We've used them in industry. We've instrumentalized them, etc. So we understand more about animals than we understand about robots. And I think there's always a fear of the unknown. We always seek to keep at arm's length the other that we don't understand, whether that's somebody, whether that's a machine, or whether that is even an immigrant or someone who's coming from another country who we don't know doesn't fit within the culture of our particular culture. There's always this element of mistrust, the fear of the unknown, and it takes time to build up trust. So I think that simply, in my view, comes down to the fact that machines are new. We're seeking to understand them. We don't clearly understand ramifications of them, but over time that might change as more arguments are brought to the table.
And that might even be the argument for it, right? Because maybe it's not just irrational mistrust. There's also some differences between the technologies being used in animals, in that, to change the capabilities of an animal, you have to breed a new animal. There are a lot more constraints, but to change the capabilities of a technology is much easier, might be more invisible, is also driven by corporate interests in a way that, the use of animals is not necessarily.
Well, sometimes though, that's another thing we've been learning is how much corporate interests and, is channeling it. But I certainly take your point that a corporation doesn't get to design an animal from scratch the way that we do with a robot. One of the things that I've been thinking about, again, I teach tort law, and so animals come up, right? Probably not in the way that you expect or want, but they come up. And so one idea is that if you have an animal in your home or in your yard that is a domestic animal and is sort of well understood by everybody, you know what I mean? So it's like a cat or a dog or a chicken or something. We have expectations and mental models. Then if something goes wrong, then often you're treated to a negligence standard, meaning should you have been more reasonably prudent. But if you decide to bring in an animal that is not familiar to the neighborhood, like a tiger, right, or some other kind of animal, then you are responsible for what goes wrong, irrespective of whether you showed any kind of care, right? And what I want to point out about that is that it provides a disincentive to people to bring animals into a context in which they won't thrive. Do you see what I mean? But once you do bring, on the one hand, on the other hand, it means that if you decide that you do want to bring an animal into a context in which it's not appropriate for it to be, then you're responsible for what happens, and so it may actually cause you to be quite restrictive of that animal's ability, liberty, and movement. And so if you're the kind of roadside attraction that a lot of you have been fighting so hard to shut down, you may be thinking that the conditions are partly about trying to contain an animal that they would be responsible for. All right. Well, we've talked a lot, and we want to make sure to hear from you about your thoughts and your questions. And then I have a couple more if people are interested. But does anyone have any questions or any thoughts for the panel? Yeah. Do we have a microphone, or you just want to? Oh, perfect. I can't see it. Yeah, great.
So thank you very much. So I have a question about, I'd like to get you to maybe help me assess how you might address this. I work a lot on trying to replace animals in toxicity testing with alternatives. Many of those alternatives are cell systems, some 2D, some 3D, some are organs on a chip. A lot of this is done in Massachusetts, I might say. Not at your institution, at that other institution, no. Anyway, these are getting more and more human-like in the sense that that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to replicate human systems. And there are already discussions in the literature about these mini-brains that are producing quote-unquote brain waves. So my question for you is, can you help me and the other people here develop a framework about how to think about these things, which are inanimate, robot-like objects, and when do they cross the line, if you will, or is there a line that they cross where we need to start to treat them differently, both ethically, morally, and under the law? So that, I hope that's an interesting question for you.
It's a very interesting question, in my view. Yeah. Thoughts?
Yeah, it's funny because people are always talking about artificial superintelligence in my world, and I just think that we're not even close to that. But what we are close to is, you know, there's a lot of stuff happening in biology that is going to start making us have to think about, you know, what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be human or an animal? I don't think I have a good answer for that one. For the brain one, I don't know the details. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I mean, insofar as the question was about building a legal framework, then I mean, of course, there's many different legal philosophies that come into that. I guess the most obvious one for me would be the rational choice theory of law, which is ultimately pointing out the benefits of why a particular form of testing should be undertaken above all else. And so, of course, look at the advantages and disadvantages to both, which goes back to basic utilitarian theory, kind of working out where the benefits and the costs of both lie. And so it's about making the arguments. But insofar as we're saying that it's these new forms of tests that should be carried out over and above animals, then I guess it's not just bringing in the utilitarian theory as to why it benefits us to test X as opposed to Y. I think we also need to look at the ontological argument that at the same time, undermining the dignity of animals, is something which we don't want to tolerate. So what we're seeking to do in constructing any law is drawing upon all these various legal philosophies and seeking to bring the elements that legislatures, of course, debate and scrutinize when they're making law. So it's principally about drawing upon those different theories.
I keep thinking about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the cows that they engineer to want to be eaten. That's a tough one. What do you do with that?
Oh, I forgot about that, yeah. Well, I was thinking, I don't know if you're familiar with the movie from this past year called, I believe it's called Us. Does anyone know this movie? I don't want to ruin the movie for anybody, it's scary. So if you don't like scary movies, like my wife doesn't like scary movies, don't go see it. But the premise is the idea that there would be like a alternate version, like a clone of us, that if anything could go wrong, we could use that clone. You know what I mean? And that kind of thing, right? So I think if you take this idea to its logical extension, we might get into some dangerous territory. But I think personally think we're very far from that, and that anything we can do to reliably test chemicals and other problems, not on living beings, right, is a win, and that down the line, perhaps far down the line, we need to be vigilant about are we making living things just to test stuff on them, right? But that feels kind of far away. If you wanted to look into who would be interesting on this question, I don't know where the individual went. So what I would suggest to you is that Nita Farahani at Duke Law School, as well as Hank Greeley at Stanford, are both very, very wise on these issues. They are bioethics law professors, and I would be happy to introduce you to them because I think it would be of great interest. Please.
Hi, this is directed towards Dr. Kathrani. Yesterday, a speaker at the conference mentioned that the definition of a human as being able to use tools was dethroned by evidence of fish using tools and other animals using tools. Because there is a developing reliance of humans to use technology such as automated insulin pumps and glasses, I wanted to ask, what is the justification for the ontological premise that robots are a separate category than humans?
I mean,
That's a great question.
So the justification for why robots are ontologically different, I mean, it's in the very notion of ontology in itself is. Ontology is a study of being, and the mere fact that machines exist means they exist, they're there to be. So the very fact that they happen to exist within our life world supports their very ontology, their very existence. So they happen to be something which is in our world. We can't ignore them. I also feel that what happens is that when we don't recognize the ontology when we don't take an ontological approach to things, we tend to instrumentalize them. And Ryan mentioned at the beginning my research in Sartre, in my PhD, for example. And I'll briefly explain how that interest came about because it relates to the question. I mentioned at the start that I was working with asylum seekers, and when I used to accompany asylum seekers to detention centers, the way in which the law was applied to them was very instrumental in terms of, well, what does the policy say? What does the stats say? What does perceptions about immigration say? And what I realized was that when those that are applying the law apply the law, there's often a tendency to instrumentalize the law and not address two things, the being of the person in front of you and one's own being. And this kind of got me interested in Sartre. And for those of you who know what Sartre said, his famous line was that existence precedes essence, that first of all we exist as people, and then we define our way in the world. And I felt that we're looking at the way in which the law was applied, it was reversed, that these people that were applying the law felt that their essence, the idea that they had to act in a certain way, then defined who they were as judges, as caseworkers, or what have you. So for me, I realized that it's very important in approaching the law that one takes an ontological approach, which then took me on to looking at Levinas. Have any of you heard of Levinas as a theorist? What Levinas said was that ontology is the first ethical principle, that the face of the other. That even before we start to construct ethics, we need to recognize ourselves and recognize ourselves in the other, in the face of the other. And then once we have that communion, then we can go ahead and basically seek to build ethical principles because we realize that we're ultimately one. And so when I look at machines and robots, there's two approaches that one can take. One can take a binary approach and say, look, I'm going to ignore the fact that I'm a being, the machine's a being, and just look at the machine as an entity, as something of not having value, and then what that does is that instrumentalizes, in my view. Whereas if one says, stop, I am a being myself, that thing is a being, we both approach ourselves on the same ontological basis, then we can start to think about, well, look, that in my mind engenders an element of respect for the other, which I think is an important premise for us to then go ahead and build principles upon. So I hope that answers your question, but that's not where my interest in ontology arises.
So, Keith, I'll ask it in a different way, which is, are cyborgs robots? Are robots cyborgs? Is there any difference? Are we kind of all trending together in the same way? Yeah.
Well, I don't know. This is so interesting because I've always thought that putting things in different categories just lends itself to speciesism, which creates a distinction in rights, based on differences that shouldn't matter for rights, So this is an interesting, different way of looking at it. But yeah, my whole interest in robot rights, I'm not really interested in questions of robots becoming sentient and developing feelings because I think that's so far away. But I do think that cyborgs is something that's coming sooner than that, and so we're going to have to grapple with similar questions before we even get to the thing that people always want to talk about in robotics, which is what happens when the robots become as smart as us.
It is interesting. I will just say briefly, because there's a lot of folks who want to get in, that there has of course been a history of we draw the line here, right? And then it turns out that the thing that we're trying to exclude crosses that line, and then we draw it over here, then we draw it over here. And that phenomenon is also playing out in robotics and AI in a very overt way, where we're saying, intelligence is when you can beat somebody at chess, and then like IBM kicks everyone's ass, and then people go, well, actually, intelligence is when, you know what I mean, and so on and so on. And so there's a similar phenomenon. Please.
Hi. So one thing that we heard a lot about yesterday, and in the field of animal law are thinking more and more about, is what our non-human clients want, right, as individuals. And so that kind of brings up the question of like, well, how do they experience the world? And we don't know. We can't know as far as, at this point. And so I was just curious, you're talking about assigning moral patiency and perhaps even legal rights to an entity. And to me, that's implicitly acknowledging that that entity has its own interests. And in order to have its own interests, that entity must be experiencing the world, right? And so I'm just curious if that brings up this question of consciousness. And I'm just curious if any of your work has looked at, that the concept of consciousness and tried to shed any light on, what consciousness actually is and how to best think about what another is experiencing. Thanks.
Yeah. So like I just mentioned, I am actually less interested in the whole consciousness question than I am in the question of whether robots might deserve some sort of moral treatment without even getting into that. So I don't know if any of you watched the show Westworld. So Westworld, you have this world, you have these robots that look incredibly lifelike, like humans, and you can just go and shoot them and do whatever you want to them because they're just robots. And I was so disappointed when the show kind of turned into these questions of consciousness, because I really wanted the show to grapple with, is it okay to shoot the robots even if they're not conscious? Or does that say something about you as a human? If you enjoy doing that, or could that even change who you're? And they do look at that a little bit. Like one of the characters is changed through his experiences in Westworld and yada yada. But maybe moral patiency is the wrong word. But I do think even before we get to consciousness questions, we do have to wonder, what does it do to people if they behave violently towards these robots? And is that a reason to actually restrict what people can and can't do with certain robots or not? And the question has already come up a little bit with sex robots, and whether there are certain behaviors, sexual behaviors that might sex robots might provide a healthy outlet for, or whether they're just reinforcing certain behaviors if you have a habit of using sex robots a certain way. And there are already discussions happening about banning sex robots, so it's very real, very now, before we even get to the question of consciousness. But you've probably thought a little bit more about the consciousness question.
I have. I want to put a question out there, and again, I'm not advocating this, it's just a theoretical question. And that would be, how do we know that machines aren't conscious and they don't experience sentience? We cannot, of course, step outside our own human-centric notions of what consciousness is. I can never be a machine. I can never be a bat, or whatever you want to call it. So it's an assumption that we assume that machines aren't sentient, that they don't have consciousness, etc. And the question that one needs to ask is that, are we then imposing a hierarchy upon the beings in this world and saying, well, actually, it's for us to define which beings have consciousness, which beings have sentience? So that's a question I put out there, whether that's a legitimate approach or whether it's not a legitimate approach. The second point I'd make is that, do rights have to be attached to sentience? Are we again falling into that category area that I referred to before, that hitherto we've always understood rights to be something that basically protect elements of what it means to be and to experience and to feel and to live our life, our ways in the world. Certainly that's what human rights are. They protect our ways of being. Animal rights, of course, we conceive of those in the same way. But are we now constricting ourselves or restricting ourselves by making a category fallacy in terms of how we approach rights? Why can't machines have rights? Again, the argument isn't that we're conflating human animal rights with machine rights. It's just a different category altogether. So there's two questions, I think, from a theoretical perspective, again, not from an advocacy perspective, I think we need to consider. Question A, can we assume that machines don't have consciousness or their own life world? And question B, do rights have to attach to sentience, or can they attach to non-sentient beings as well?
So I just want to interject here that at a very practical level, again, at least what I consider myself to study is the intersection between law and emerging technology. And one of the things that we see a lot is that when new techniques, scientific techniques, but also technologies arise, that can affect our access to evidence about the world. So for example, today we talk about being able to detect people's pain through fMRI, and that matters because then we can figure out how much compensation someone should get because they fell in a supermarket. Are they just faking it, right? Or do they really experience the pain? And they say they experience the pain, and they're wearing that brace and so on. But so and so saw them skiing. You know what I mean? And so the introduction of the fMRI is being offered as and so I feel like there's got to be interesting intersections where new technologies have elucidated just how much qualia there is to an animal. That is to say that how much an animal does feel and how much they can, you know what I mean, and that sort of thing. And even also at a rhetorical, strategic level, just the ability to record whale sounds. Like think of what that did as a catalyst, and so on. And so there's a sense in which, and then of course the previous question about can we replace animals with technology so that we don't have to torture them just to figure out if a lipstick is irritating. You know what I mean? And so there's an interesting interplay between technology and animal love.
I just have a very, very quick follow-up point to that. Of course, there's now emergent technologies. The way in which we live our lives is now changing. I mean, I always used to joke with my law students that when I was at law school 25 years ago, I used to go to the library and get those big law reports out and have to read pages and pages, whereas now one can just access law reports on their screen. So the way in which we live our lives is changing as a result of technology. And that begs the question, does our language also have to change? Do our concepts and our understanding of the world also have to evolve too? I mean, the way in which we construct our world, as some philosophers might say, is ultimately conceptual. I sit on a chair, I say hello to people, hello, greet. So is the way in which the world is now changing, challenging our approach to language? And does that now mean that we have to look at our terms and concepts? And within that same bracket, going back to the theme of this conference, legal status of animals. I mean, do the fact that we're countenancing the fact that robots should have rights mean that we now have to go back and say, well, look, if we're discussing the idea of robots having rights, then certainly animals should have them as well. And if we're able to give companies, rivers, mountains, etc., call them persons, why can't we treat animals as persons, etc.? So all of these technologies, they raise questions of concepts and language as well that they need to be addressed.
Okay, please, you've been very patient. Thank you very much.
Hi. So what you were saying earlier actually segues really nicely into my question, which was, has there actually been any studies done to show whether violence against robots does exercise the cruelty muscle, or if it's a therapeutic exercise of existing violent urges? And if so, if there's been any distinctions made between different victims, like humans versus non-human animals, or types of crimes such as sexual versus non-sexual?
Yeah, so there is no scientific evidence, and there are some parallels to other fields of study, like, people have tried to look at the question of violence in video games, right? And that has never, I think, scientifically been fully conclusive. We seem to have settled on, okay, people or adults at least, are probably able to compartmentalize. There's no evidence really that playing a violent video game makes you a more violent person. But with kids, we're not so sure, so we're going to restrict it for kids, right? That's where most countries have come down on it. The reason we need to re-examine that question in the context of robotics is that we are really physical creatures, and there are studies that show that interacting with something in your physical space is very different than interacting with something on a screen. We'll treat the thing more like a social actor. But there have been no studies that really get at that question. It's something that's very difficult to study. We did do a study that looked at the relationship between people's tendencies for empathy and how they were willing to treat a robot. So we had hex bugs, which is a little toy that moves around like an insect, and we had people come into the lab and smash them with mallets, and we were timing their hesitation to smash them depending on things like whether we gave the thing a name, or like I said, we matched it with we did psychological empathy testing with people, and we found, a correlation between, low empathy and just smashing the hex bug, and high empathy and hesitating more. So there does seem to be a connection where we can, and it's not just this study. Other people have done studies in this vein too. We think that it's possible we might be able to measure people's empathy with robots, and it might say something about you depending on how you treat the robot, but we don't know whether it changes. We don't know whether we can actually influence people's habits or not. That's something that's one of my research interests for moving forward.
I apologize, Kate, I didn't mean to. I was just going to say that you can still make policy on the basis of correlations. And I honestly can't remember, Kate, if this is your example or mine or someone else's, and I apologize if it's yours. But one example of that is that quite clearly there is a correlation between people who abuse animals and people who abuse children. You know what I mean? Like, that is like a very, very well-established thing. So much so that many, many jurisdictions have rules that say that if you respond to a child abuse and there's an animal in the home, you call protective services and vice versa, right? Now, you could imagine a world of advanced robotics where they don't have feelings or anything like that, but if you see someone treating kicking a robot dog, you ask yourself, society maybe should keep an eye on that person, right? And so you can make policy even in the absence of a strong evidence that it's morally perverting, you know what I mean, and so on. And I think that's important.
But we don't know, like, it could also be a healthy outlet for violent behavior. Like, if someone is low empathy and they just want to kick the shit out of something, isn't it better if they use a robot?
Yeah,
we don't know.
I hear you. You're right.
We have
there
our
is that
guesses,
tension.
but we don't know.
But this whole argument about smart assistants, for example, the way it's not just about violence, it's about communication. The way in which children now, for example, are communicating with these smart assistants, like rather than saying please and thank you, are giving orders. And the question then becomes, are the way in which we're socializing children now changing, of course, traditional agencies of socialization, family, friends, schools, used to transmit those values throughout the ages in terms of saying please, thank you, and showing gratitude. But now, if machines are capable of being ordered and instructed to act without those prescriptive normative words, and of course that changes language. And we were discussing it yesterday, and I thought it was a very interesting point.
Yeah, because people have complained to Amazon and Google that their kids are turning into assholes because Alexa doesn't require them to say please or thank you. And so there were so many complaints that they released features that you can turn on, like I think it's called like the magic word feature or something, where she does require you to say please, because people were worried that their kids were getting into these habits.
And then we're worried as a parent, worried that you're getting into bad habits, but also like, should a company, even if it's a feature and it's optional, should a company be able to make you be polite to its product? You know what I mean? For it to work. And is it teaching kids that anyway, that everything is equivalent? So please, yeah.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Thanks for the interesting discussion. And I think this has been touched on a little already, increasingly so while I waited to get to the mic, but I think there's still a question left. And my question is, you're always hearing people say things like, what makes us, different from other animals is X. What makes us human is X. And, I'm wondering how you would answer that question, or whether we're really just all in one category with slight variations. Is there something that makes us different, distinctly different from other animals, or something really monumental?
I think there is, but my confidence in that question has dwindled over the course of this weekend. And in the course of my contact with Pam and others in the center. I mean, my own personal view has been that humans are unique in our ability to have meaning making. That is to say, to understand narrative and to generate narrative and to make certain kinds of meaning. But again, I have to say I'm not that committed to that, because I think that there are probably instances where animals are doing that. I do think that with machines and people, it is that notion of qualia, of having an internal experience. But again, I mean, there's some kind of readout of the sensors that you could sort of look at and say this is qualia-like. But I'm interested, of course, in your thoughts.
I mean, so of course there are many definitions. There's the biological, there's the social, there's even economic, political, etc. But the thing that I have with all of those frames of reference is that they're deterministic. And essentially we're putting ourselves in a bracket, into a category of saying that we are this, we are that. In this respect, I was drawn quite heavily to the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, when he talks about this notion of design, or the fact that there is just something ontologically about being human that is just what it is. I mean, you can't really define it. It's the way in which we engage with the world, etc. If I was to say that what makes me human is that I give meaning and purpose, I give purpose to things, then I see a chair there, and I give that chair a purpose, that my purpose is to sit on it. And I start thinking about that chair as something distinct from me. Whereas I think there's something even much before that, which is that the chair doesn't really exist. I don't think about the chair. If I was to see a chair there, I wouldn't think, oh my God, there's a chair, I'm going to sit down. I just do it instinctively because it's just the human thing to do. So I think that even before we place any sort of layers upon ourselves, there is just something primordial about being human. And that's the way, and it can't be defined. It is what it is.
For me, I'm like, yeah, of course, there are plenty of differences. Like, there's a difference between me and Paresh. I have a different hair color. Does that justify a difference in moral treatment or rights? No. Like, why are we there can be lots of differences. The question for me is, are there differences that justify a different treatment? So why are you drawing that line? And those are the differences that would matter. And I don't know, in the case of humans and animals, I don't think there's a lot of reason to treat, humans differently when it comes to things like suffering.
I should just add that the reason I adopt that theory is because once you recognize that I can't define what it means to be a human being, and it is what it just is, it follows from that logic. I can't define what it means to be an animal. An animal is just what an animal is. I can't define what a robot is. It is what it is. And then that gives us some level of equivalence, which I think is important. But it's not to say that it's detrimental equivalence, that one gets something over and above another. It's just recognizing that these things are what they are, and that everything we seek to build on top of that are just things that we ourselves bring to the table, and we just build, those layers are constructed by people upon these primordial levels of being.
But so the thing that I worry about with this is, it might be attractive to say that there are more commonalities between animals and non-human animals and humans. There is a lot there, right? But then you don't want to run into a slippery slope argument where now we can't eat plants or we can't step on bugs or something like that, right? And so what was so fascinating to me was to hear people talk about this idea of being anthropocentric, and like, how close is the animal to us? That's going to be how much we treat it with respect, right? And if we look at a fish might not be. And I wonder a lot, and I have to do a lot more investigation because I just have no idea, but I'd love to hear, how do you go about grappling with those category differences? And where do you put the bottom? Like, I understand the attraction to collapsing the distinctions between people and non-human animals, but I don't know where the limiting principle would be then in terms of other kinds of living beings. Please.
Thank you very much for that interesting discussion. This is actually a perfect transition into my question, because one limiting principle or threshold to being considered for moral value that has resonance with a lot but not all of the, what should we say, non-human animal interested community is summarized in the famous Bentham quote that Peter Singer sort of talks about, which is, that what matters is not, can they think, can they reason, can they speak, can they play Go, but can they suffer? And sort of tied up in that is sentience. And I take Dr. Kathrani's point that it's not necessarily true that we can assume we know where that line between being able to suffer, being sentient is, but we don't know nothing about it. We don't have any problem kicking rocks, and we do have a problem kicking dogs. And we have heuristics like a precautionary principle. Yes, it's variable depending who you ask what it is, but no, it's not perfect, but it's something. And I'm wondering what, I guess, each of your reactions is to that as the limiting principle, and just kind of thinking that that might even be applicable to machines if and when they gain some sort of self-awareness, sentience, capacity to suffer. Thank you.
So we only have a couple minutes left, so what I'm going to offer is, could you please ask your question if you have it, then we'll answer all of them together and wrap up.
Actually, I did not anticipate that he would essentially ask my question.
Oh, okay. There we go. All right. Great. So the questions on the table are whether or not suffering could be the limiting principle we're looking for, and what the role of suffering is. And since you have suffered through this panel with us, and we really appreciate it, this is a very good note to end on. So what do you think? Can suffering be the right principle?
I think that whether it's suffering or whether it's non-suffering, there are a number of different principles that can be brought to the table. And it's not that, I don't think any one principle at any one given point in time is necessarily the most dominant one. I think what matters is that whatever principle one subscribes to, that they take responsibility for it. I think the notion of responsibility is the most important thing for me. And certainly, some people might say, well, it's suffering. Some people might say, well, there's another principle that applies here. But I take the point that that's arguably a very good principle, but then that would, in my view, exclude robots. And it goes back to the point I made before. There might be good reasons for giving robots rights. Say, for example, we value the notion of what intelligence is. We value the fact that we believe that Siri and Alexa should be spoken to with respect, because of the fact that the way in which our children will ultimately be raised requires that they be spoken to with respect. So I don't think it's about any one principle being dominant above any other principle. But what I think matters most is that whatever principle one adopts, that they take responsibility for it, and ultimately, that, for me, that's the most important thing.
Okay.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. So I've always been drawn to the suffering as the one that makes a lot of sense to me in the whole animal ethics question. But I spent a lot of time in college trying to find like that limiting principle and how would you apply it consistently, and it drives you crazy after a while, because when it comes down to it, you can't apply any of these consistently across the board, right? And or they end up not making sense. So I do think that there can be multiple principles that you try to apply, and also at some point I realized that the whole field of law often deals with drawing arbitrary lines that aren't perfect, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. So I've become more comfortable with like not perfect lines, but just trying to get as close as possible. So maybe in the animal case it's suffering, or maybe suffering plus a couple other reasons why we might want to protect animals. Maybe in the robot case, it's more the Kantian argument, more of a utilitarian argument, but there's no reason we can't combine things.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, the idea that an animal would have the capacity not only to suffer but to experience joy, which would then be a reason not to put them down through a non-painful way to end their life just because they're inconvenient, right, for example. So anyway, this, at least for me, has been really educational, and so please join me in thanking our great panelists, and thank you to all of you. Appreciate it a lot.